Chapter 4 of the Haunted Hotel. On the day of the marriage, Agnes Lockwood sat alone in the little drawing room of her London lodgings, burning the letters which had been written to her by Montbarry in the bygone time. The Countess's maliciously smart description of her, addressed to Doctor Wybrow, had not even hinted at the charm that most distinguished Agnes, the artless expression of goodness and purity which instantly attracted everyone who approached her. She looked by many years younger than she really was. With her fair complexion and her shy manner, it seemed only natural to speak of her as a girl, although she was now really advancing towards 30 years of age. She lived alone, with an old nurse devoted to her, on a modest little income, which was just enough to support the two. There were none of the ordinary signs of grief in her face, as she slowly tore the letters of her false lover in two, and threw the pieces into the small fire which had been lit to consume them. Unhappily for herself, she was one of those women who feel too deeply to find relief in tears. Pale and quiet, with cold, trembling fingers, she destroyed the letters one by one without daring to read them again. She had torn the last of the series, and was still shrinking from throwing it after the rest into the swiftly destroying flame, when the old nurse came in, and asked if she would see Master Henry, meaning that youngest member of the Westwick family, who had publicly declared his contempt for his brother in the smoking room of the club. Agnes hesitated. A faint tinge of colour stole over her face. There had been a long past time when Henry Westwick had owned that he loved her. She had made her confession to him, acknowledging that her heart was given to his eldest brother. He had submitted to his disappointment, and they had met thenceforth as cousins and friends. Never before had she associated the idea of him with embarrassing recollections. But now, on the very day when his brother's marriage to another woman had consummated his brother's treason towards her, there was something vaguely repellent in the prospect of seeing him. The old nurse, who remembered them both in their cradles, observed her hesitation, and, sympathizing of course with the man, put in a timely word for Henry. "He says he's going away, my dear, and he only wants to shake hands and say good bye." This plain statement of the case had its effect. Agnes decided on receiving her cousin. He entered the room so rapidly that he surprised her in the act of throwing the fragments of Montbarry's last letter into the fire. She hurriedly spoke first. "You are leaving London very suddenly, Henry. Is it business or pleasure?" Instead of answering her, he pointed to the flaming letter, and to some black ashes of burnt paper lying lightly in the lower part of the fireplace. "Are you burning letters?" "Yes." "His letters?" "Yes." He took her hand gently. "I had no idea I was intruding on you, at a time when you must wish to be alone. Forgive me, Agnes. I shall see you when I return." She signed to him with a faint smile to take a chair. "We have known one another since we were children," she said. "Why should I feel a foolish pride about myself in your presence? Why should I have any secrets from you? I sent back all your brother's gifts to me some time ago. I have been advised to do more, to keep nothing that can remind me of him, in short, to burn his letters. I have taken the advice, but I own I shrank a little from destroying the last of the letters. No, not because it was the last, but because it had this in it." She opened her hand, and showed him a lock of Montbarry's hair, tied with a morsel of golden cord. "Well, well, let it go with the rest." She dropped it into the flame. For a while she stood with her back to Henry, leaning on the mantelpiece and looking into the fire. He took the chair to which she had pointed, with a strange contradiction of expression in his face. The tears were in his eyes, while the brows above were knit close in an angry frown. He muttered to himself, "Damn him!" She rallied her courage, and looked at him again when she spoke. "Well, Henry, and why are you going away?" "I am out of spirits, Agnes, and I want a change." She paused before she spoke again. His face told her plainly that he was thinking of her when he made that reply. She was grateful to him, but her mind was not with him. Her mind was still with the man who had deserted her. She turned round again to the fire. "Is it true," she asked, after a long silence, "that they have been married today?" He answered ungraciously in the one necessary word, "Yes." "Did you go to the church?" He resented the question with an expression of indignant surprise. "Go to the church?" he repeated. "I would as soon go to—" He checked himself there. "How can you ask?" he added in lower tones. "I have never spoken to Montbarry. I have not even seen him, since he treated you like the scoundrel and the fool that he is." She looked at him suddenly, without saying a word. He understood her and begged her pardon, but he was still angry. "The reckoning comes to some men," he said, "even in this world. He will live to rue the day when he married that woman." Agnes took a chair by his side, and looked at him with a gentle surprise. "Is it quite reasonable to be so angry with her because your brother preferred her to me?" she asked. Henry turned on her sharply. "Do you defend the Countess, of all the people in the world?" "Why not?" Agnes answered. "I know nothing against her. On the only occasion when we met, she appeared to be a singularly timid, nervous person, looking dreadfully ill, and being indeed so ill that she fainted under the heat of my room. Why should we not do her justice? We know that she was innocent of any intention to wrong me. We know that she was not aware of my engagement." Henry lifted his hand impatiently and stopped her. "There is such a thing as being too just and too forgiving," he interposed. "I can't bear to hear you talk in that patient way, after the scandalously cruel manner in which you have been treated. Try to forget them both, Agnes. I wish to God I could help you to do it." Agnes laid her hand on his arm. "You are very good to me, Henry, but you don't quite understand me. I was thinking of myself and my trouble in quite a different way when you came in. I was wondering whether anything which has so entirely filled my heart, and so absorbed all that is best and truest in me, as my feeling for your brother, can really pass away as if it had never existed. I have destroyed the last visible things that remind me of him. In this world I shall see him no more. But is the tie that once bound us completely broken? Am I as entirely parted from the good and evil fortune of his life as if we had never met and never loved? What do you think, Henry? I can hardly believe it." "If you could bring the retribution on him that he has deserved," Henry Westwick answered sternly, "I might be inclined to agree with you." As that reply passed his lips, the old nurse appeared again at the door, announcing another visitor. "I'm sorry to disturb you, my dear, but here is little Mrs. Ferrari, wanting to know when she may say a few words to you." Agnes turned to Henry before she replied. "You remember Emily Bidwell, my favourite pupil years ago at the village school, and afterwards my maid? She left me to marry an Italian courier named Ferrari, and I am afraid it has not turned out very well. Do you mind my having her in here for a minute or two?" Henry rose to take his leave. "I should be glad to see Emily again at any other time," he said, "but it is best that I should go now. My mind is disturbed, Agnes. I might say things to you, if I stayed here any longer, which are better not said now. I shall cross the Channel by the mail tonight, and see how a few weeks' change will help me." He took her hand. "Is there anything in the world that I can do for you?" he asked very earnestly. She thanked him, and tried to release her hand. He held it with a tremulous, lingering grasp. "God bless you, Agnes," he said in faltering tones, with his eyes on the ground. Her face flushed again, and the next instant turned paler than ever. She knew his heart as well as he knew it himself. She was too distressed to speak. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissed it fervently, and, without looking at her again, left the room. The nurse hobbled after him to the head of the stairs. She had not forgotten the time when the younger brother had been the unsuccessful rival of the elder for the hand of Agnes. "Don't be downhearted, Master Henry," whispered the old woman, with the unscrupulous common sense of persons in the lower rank of life. "Try her again when you come back." Left alone for a few moments, Agnes took a turn in the room, trying to compose herself. She paused before a little water-colour drawing on the wall, which had belonged to her mother. It was her own portrait when she was a child. "How much happier we should be," she thought to herself sadly, "if we never grew up." The courier's wife was shown in, a little meek melancholy woman, with white eyelashes and watery eyes, who curtsied deferentially, and was troubled with a small chronic cough. Agnes shook hands with her kindly. "Well, Emily, what can I do for you?" The courier's wife made rather a strange answer. "I'm afraid to tell you, miss." "Is it such a very difficult favour to grant? Sit down, and let me hear how you are going on. Perhaps the petition will slip out while we are talking. How does your husband behave to you?" Emily's light grey eyes looked more watery than ever. She shook her head and sighed resignedly. "I have no positive complaint to make against him, miss. But I am afraid he doesn't care about me, and he seems to take no interest in his home. I may almost say he's tired of his home. It might be better for both of us, miss, if he went travelling for a while, not to mention the money, which is beginning to be wanted sadly." She put her handkerchief to her eyes and sighed again, more resignedly than ever. "I don't quite understand," said Agnes. "I thought your husband had an engagement to take some ladies to Switzerland and Italy." "That was his ill luck, miss. One of the ladies fell ill, and the others wouldn't go without her. They paid him a month's salary as compensation, but they had engaged him for the autumn and winter, and the loss is serious." "I am sorry to hear it, Emily. Let us hope he will soon have another chance." "It's not his turn, miss, to be recommended when the next applications come to the courier's office. You see, there are so many of them out of employment just now. If he could be privately recommended—" She stopped, and left the unfinished sentence to speak for itself. Agnes understood her directly. "You want my recommendation," she rejoined. "Why couldn't you say so at once?" Emily blushed. "It would be such a chance for my husband," she answered confusedly. "A letter inquiring for a good courier. A 6 months' engagement, miss, came to the office this morning. It's another man's turn to be chosen, and the secretary will recommend him. If my husband could only send his testimonials by the same post, with just a word in your name, miss, it might turn the scale, as they say. A private recommendation between gentlefolks goes so far." She stopped again, and sighed again, and looked down at the carpet, as if she had some private reason for feeling a little ashamed of herself. Agnes began to be rather weary of the persistent tone of mystery in which her visitor spoke. "If you want my interest with any friend of mine," she said, "why can't you tell me the name?" The courier's wife began to cry. "I'm ashamed to tell you, miss." For the first time, Agnes spoke sharply. "Nonsense, Emily! Tell me the name directly, or drop the subject, whichever you like best." Emily made a last desperate effort. She wrung her handkerchief in her lap, and let off the name as if she had been letting off a loaded gun. "Lord Montbarry!" Agnes rose and looked at her. "You have disappointed me," she said very quietly, but with a look which the courier's wife had never seen in her face before. "Knowing what you know, you ought to be aware that it is impossible for me to communicate with Lord Montbarry. I always supposed you had some delicacy of feeling. I am sorry to find that I have been mistaken." Weak as she was, Emily had spirit enough to feel the reproof. She walked in her meek, noiseless way to the door. "I beg your pardon, miss. I am not quite so bad as you think me, but I beg your pardon all the same." She opened the door. Agnes called her back. There was something in the woman's apology that appealed irresistibly to her just and generous nature. "Come," she said, "we must not part in this way. Let me not misunderstand you. What is it that you expected me to do?" Emily was wise enough to answer this time without any reserve. "My husband will send his testimonials, miss, to Lord Montbarry in Scotland. I only wanted you to let him say in his letter that his wife has been known to you since she was a child, and that you feel some little interest in his welfare on that account. I don't ask it now, miss. You have made me understand that I was wrong." Had she really been wrong? Past remembrances, as well as present troubles, pleaded powerfully with Agnes for the courier's wife. "It seems only a small favour to ask," she said, speaking under the impulse of kindness which was the strongest impulse in her nature. "But I am not sure that I ought to allow my name to be mentioned in your husband's letter. Let me hear again exactly what he wishes to say." Emily repeated the words, and then offered one of those suggestions which have a special value of their own to persons unaccustomed to the use of their pens. "Suppose you try, miss, how it looks in writing." Childish as the idea was, Agnes tried the experiment. "If I let you mention me," she said, "we must at least decide what you are to say." She wrote the words in the briefest and plainest form. "I venture to state that my wife has been known from her childhood to Miss Agnes Lockwood, who feels some little interest in my welfare on that account." Reduced to this one sentence, there was surely nothing in the reference to her name which implied that Agnes had permitted it, or that she was even aware of it. After a last struggle with herself, she handed the written paper to Emily. "Your husband must copy it exactly, without altering anything," she stipulated. "On that condition I grant your request." Emily was not only thankful, she was really touched. Agnes hurried the little woman out of the room. "Don't give me time to repent and take it back again," she said. Emily vanished. Is the tie that once bound us completely broken? Am I as entirely parted from the good and evil fortune of his life as if we had never met and never loved? Agnes looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. Not 10 minutes since, those serious questions had been on her lips. It almost shocked her to think of the commonplace manner in which they had already met with their reply. The mail of that night would appeal once more to Montbarry's remembrance of her in the choice of a servant. 2 days later, the post brought a few grateful lines from Emily. Her husband had got the place. Ferrari was engaged, for 6 months certain, as Lord Montbarry's courier. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Haunted Hotel, a Mystery of Modern Venice. After only 1 week of travelling in Scotland, my lord and my lady returned unexpectedly to London. Introduced to the mountains and lakes of the Highlands, her ladyship positively declined to improve her acquaintance with them. When she was asked for her reason, she answered with a Roman brevity, "I have seen Switzerland." For a week more the newly married couple remained in London in the strictest retirement. On one day in that week, the nurse returned in a state of most uncustomary excitement from an errand on which Agnes had sent her. Passing the door of a fashionable dentist, she had met Lord Montbarry himself just leaving the house. The good woman's report described him, with malicious pleasure, as looking wretchedly ill. "His cheeks are getting hollow, my dear, and his beard is turning grey. I hope the dentist hurt him." Knowing how heartily her faithful old servant hated the man who had deserted her, Agnes made due allowance for a large infusion of exaggeration in the picture presented to her. The main impression produced on her mind was an impression of nervous uneasiness. If she trusted herself in the streets by daylight, while Lord Montbarry remained in London, how could she be sure that his next chance meeting might not be a meeting with herself? She waited at home, privately ashamed of her own undignified conduct, for the next 2 days. On the third day, the fashionable intelligence of the newspapers announced the departure of Lord and Lady Montbarry for Paris, on their way to Italy. Mrs. Ferrari, calling the same evening, informed Agnes that her husband had left her with all reasonable expression of conjugal kindness, his temper being improved by the prospect of going abroad. But one other servant accompanied the travellers, Lady Montbarry's maid, rather a silent, unsociable woman, so far as Emily had heard. Her ladyship's brother, Baron Rivar, was already on the Continent. It had been arranged that he was to meet his sister and her husband at Rome. One by one the dull weeks succeeded each other in the life of Agnes. She faced her position with admirable courage, seeing her friends, keeping herself occupied in her leisure hours with reading and drawing, leaving no means untried of diverting her mind from the melancholy remembrance of the past. But she had loved too faithfully, she had been wounded too deeply, to feel in any adequate degree the influence of the moral remedies which she employed. Persons who met with her in the ordinary relations of life, deceived by her outward serenity of manner, agreed that Miss Lockwood seemed to be getting over her disappointment. But an old friend and school companion, who happened to see her during a brief visit to London, was inexpressibly distressed by the change that she detected in Agnes. This lady was Mrs. Westwick, the wife of that brother of Lord Montbarry who came next to him in age, and who was described in the peerage as presumptive heir to the title. He was then away, looking after his interests in some mining property which he possessed in America. Mrs. Westwick insisted on taking Agnes back with her to her home in Ireland. "Come and keep me company while my husband is away. My 3 little girls will make you their playfellow, and the only stranger you will meet is the governess, whom I answer for your liking beforehand. Pack up your things, and I will call for you tomorrow on my way to the train." In those hearty terms the invitation was given. Agnes thankfully accepted it. For 3 happy months she lived under the roof of her friend. The girls hung around her in tears at her departure. The youngest of them wanted to go back with Agnes to London. Half in jest, half in earnest, she said to her old friend at parting, "If your governess leaves you, keep the place open for me." Mrs. Westwick laughed. The wiser children took it seriously, and promised to let Agnes know. On the very day when Miss Lockwood returned to London, she was recalled to those associations with the past which she was most anxious to forget. After the first kissings and greetings were over, the old nurse, who had been left in charge at the lodgings, had some startling information to communicate, derived from the courier's wife. "Here has been little Mrs. Ferrari, my dear, in a dreadful state of mind, inquiring when you would be back. Her husband has left Lord Montbarry without a word of warning, and nobody knows what has become of him." Agnes looked at her in astonishment. "Are you sure of what you are saying?" she asked. The nurse was quite sure. "Why, Lord bless you! The news comes from the courier's office in Golden Square, from the secretary, Miss Agnes, the secretary himself." Hearing this, Agnes began to feel alarmed as well as surprised. It was still early in the evening. She at once sent a message to Mrs. Ferrari to say that she had returned. In an hour more the courier's wife appeared in a state of agitation which it was not easy to control. Her narrative, when she was at last able to speak connectedly, entirely confirmed the nurse's report of it. After hearing from her husband with tolerable regularity from Paris, Rome, and Venice, Emily had twice written to him afterwards, and had received no reply. Feeling uneasy, she had gone to the office in Golden Square to inquire if he had been heard of there. The post of the morning had brought a letter to the secretary from a courier then at Venice. It contained startling news of Ferrari. His wife had been allowed to take a copy of it, which she now handed to Agnes to read. The writer stated that he had recently arrived in Venice. He had previously heard that Ferrari was with Lord and Lady Montbarry at one of the old Venetian palaces which they had hired for a term. Being a friend of Ferrari, he had gone to pay him a visit. Ringing at the door that opened on the canal, and failing to make any one hear him, he had gone round to a side entrance opening on one of the narrow lanes of Venice. Here, standing at the door, as if she was waiting for him to try that way next, he found a pale woman with magnificent dark eyes, who proved to be no other than Lady Montbarry herself. She asked in Italian what he wanted. He answered that he wanted to see the courier Ferrari if it was quite convenient. She at once informed him that Ferrari had left the palace without assigning any reason, and without even leaving an address at which his monthly salary then due to him could be paid. Amazed at this reply, the courier inquired if any person had offended Ferrari or quarrelled with him. The lady answered, "To my knowledge, certainly not. I am Lady Montbarry, and I can positively assure you that Ferrari was treated with the greatest kindness in this house. We are as much astonished as you are at his extraordinary disappearance. If you should hear of him, pray let us know, so that we may at least pay him the money which is due." After one or two more questions, quite readily answered, relating to the date and the time of day at which Ferrari had left the palace, the courier took his leave. He at once entered on the necessary investigations, without the slightest result so far as Ferrari was concerned. Nobody had seen him. Nobody appeared to have been taken into his confidence. Nobody knew anything, that is to say, anything of the slightest importance, even about persons so distinguished as Lord and Lady Montbarry. It was reported that her ladyship's English maid had left her, before the disappearance of Ferrari, to return to her relatives in her own country, and that Lord Montbarry had taken no steps to supply her place. His lordship was described as being in delicate health. He lived in the strictest retirement; nobody was admitted to him, not even his own countrymen. A stupid old woman was discovered who did the housework at the palace, arriving in the morning and going away again at night. She had never seen the lost courier; she had never even seen Lord Montbarry, who was then confined to his room. Her ladyship, a most gracious and adorable mistress, was in constant attendance on her noble husband. There was no other servant then in the house, so far as the old woman knew, but herself. The meals were sent in from a restaurant. My lord, it was said, disliked strangers. My lord's brother-in-law, the Baron, was generally shut up in a remote part of the palace, occupied, the gracious mistress said, with experiments in chemistry. The experiments sometimes made a nasty smell. A doctor had latterly been called in to his lordship, an Italian doctor, long resident in Venice. Inquiries being addressed to this gentleman, a physician of undoubted capacity and respectability, it turned out that he also had never seen Ferrari, having been summoned to the palace, as his memorandum book showed, at a date subsequent to the courier's disappearance. The doctor described Lord Montbarry's malady as bronchitis. So far, there was no reason to feel any anxiety, though the attack was a sharp one. If alarming symptoms should appear, he had arranged with her ladyship to call in another physician. For the rest, it was impossible to speak too highly of my lady. Night and day she was at her lord's bedside. With these particulars began and ended the discoveries made by Ferrari's courier friend. The police were on the lookout for the lost man, and that was the only hope which could be held forth for the present to Ferrari's wife. "What do you think of it, miss?" the poor woman asked eagerly. "What would you advise me to do?" Agnes was at a loss how to answer her. It was an effort even to listen to what Emily was saying. The references in the courier's letter to Montbarry, the report of his illness, the melancholy picture of his secluded life, had reopened the old wound. She was not even thinking of the lost Ferrari. Her mind was at Venice, by the sick man's bedside. "I hardly know what to say," she answered. "I have had no experience in serious matters of this kind." "Do you think it would help you, miss, if you read my husband's letters to me? There are only 3 of them. They won't take long to read." Agnes compassionately read the letters. They were not written in a very tender tone. "Dear Emily," and "Yours affectionately," these conventional phrases were the only phrases of endearment which they contained. In the first letter Lord Montbarry was not very favourably spoken of. "We leave Paris to morrow. I don't much like my lord. He is proud and cold, and between ourselves stingy in money matters. I have had to dispute such trifles as a few centimes in the hotel bill, and twice already some sharp remarks have passed between the newly married couple, in consequence of her ladyship's freedom in purchasing pretty tempting things at the shops in Paris. I can't afford it, you must keep to your allowance." She has had to hear those words already. For my part, I like her. She has the nice, easy foreign manners. She talks to me as if I was a human being like herself. The second letter was dated from Rome. "My lord's caprices," Ferrari wrote, "have kept us perpetually on the move. He is becoming incurably restless. I suspect he is uneasy in his mind. Painful recollections, I should say. I find him constantly reading old letters when her ladyship is not present. We were to have stopped at Genoa, but he hurried us on. The same thing at Florence. Here at Rome my lady insists on resting. Her brother has met us at this place. There has been a quarrel already, the lady's maid tells me, between my lord and the Baron. The latter wanted to borrow money of the former. His lordship refused in language which offended Baron Rivar. My lady pacified them, and made them shake hands." The third and last letter was from Venice. "More of my lord's economy. Instead of staying at the hotel, we have hired a damp, mouldy, rambling old palace. My lady insists on having the best suites of rooms wherever we go, and the palace comes cheaper for a 2 months' term. My lord tried to get it for longer. He says the quiet of Venice is good for his nerves. But a foreign speculator has secured the palace, and is going to turn it into an hotel. The Baron is still with us, and there have been more disagreements about money matters. I don't like the Baron, and I don't find the attractions of my lady grow on me. She was much nicer before the Baron joined us. My lord is a punctual paymaster. It's a matter of honour with him. He hates parting with his money, but he does it because he has given his word. I receive my salary regularly at the end of each month, not a franc extra, though I have done many things which are not part of a courier's proper work. Fancy the Baron trying to borrow money of me! He is an inveterate gambler. I didn't believe it when my lady's maid first told me so, but I have seen enough to satisfy me that she was right. I have seen other things besides which don't increase my respect for my lady and the Baron. The maid says she means to give warning to leave. She is a respectable British female, and doesn't take things quite so easily as I do. It is a dull life here. No going in to company, no company at home. Not a creature sees my lord, not even the consul or the banker. When he goes out, he goes alone, and generally towards nightfall. Indoors, he shuts himself up in his own room with his books, and sees as little of his wife and the Baron as possible. I fancy things are coming to a crisis here. If my lord's suspicions are once awakened, the consequences will be terrible. Under certain provocations, the noble Montbarry is a man who would stick at nothing. However, the pay is good, and I can't afford to talk of leaving the place like my lady's maid." Agnes handed back the letters, so suggestive of the penalty paid already for his own infatuation by the man who had deserted her, with feelings of shame and distress which made her no fit counsellor for the helpless woman who depended on her advice. "The one thing I can suggest," she said, after first speaking some kind words of comfort and hope, "is that we should consult a person of greater experience than ours. Suppose I write and ask my lawyer, who is also my friend and trustee, to come and advise us tomorrow after his business hours?" Emily eagerly and gratefully accepted the suggestion. An hour was arranged for the meeting on the next day. The correspondence was left under the care of Agnes, and the courier's wife took her leave. Weary and heartsick, Agnes lay down on the sofa to rest and compose herself. The careful nurse brought in a reviving cup of tea. Her quaint gossip about herself and her occupations while Agnes had been away acted as a relief to her mistress's overburdened mind. They were still talking quietly when they were startled by a loud knock at the house door. Hurried footsteps ascended the stairs. The door of the sitting room was thrown open violently. The courier's wife rushed in like a mad woman. "He's dead! They've murdered him!" Those wild words were all she could say. She dropped on her knees at the foot of the sofa, held out her hand with something clasped in it, and fell back in a swoon. The nurse, signing to Agnes to open the window, took the necessary measures to restore the fainting woman. "What's this?" she exclaimed. "Here's a letter in her hand. See what it is, miss." The open envelope was addressed, evidently in a faint handwriting, to Mrs. Ferrari. The postmark was Venice. The contents of the envelope were a sheet of foreign note paper and a folded enclosure. On the note paper one line only was written. It was again in a faint handwriting, and it contained these words: "To console you for the loss of your husband." Agnes opened the enclosure next. It was a Bank of England note for £1,000. End of chapter 5.